I was thinking about classical music in the movies, and of course, and I came up with kind of 5 categories. First, there's something like this. Any idea what movie that's in?
Fantasia.
Huh? Fantasia, yes. A movie that is not only has classical music, but is about classical music. They took classical music and made scenarios to go with the music. So that's a category, I think, unto itself. There aren't many pieces out there like that. There might be others, but secondly, I thought of opera in the music, in the movies. Of course, or opera in movie versions where they film an opera. And there have been some of these, most notably, right? The Magic Flute. Have anybody seen the Bergman Magic Flute? It's absolutely wonderful. A wonderful, wonderful movie. If you ever want to enjoy an opera on film, it's a great one to watch. It's in subtitles because they do it in Swedish, of all things. I'm sure the Swedish is a better translation than the English because it must be closer to the German in certain ways. But it's all subtitled, and it's kind of wonderful what they do with the characters in this movie because the Queen of the Night is smoking a cigarette backstage, and you see Zarastro, who's the bass in the piece, learning Wotan while in backstage. So there's some of these wonderful touches, and of course, famously, Rosenkavalier has this wonderful, wonderful movie production with Elizabeth Schwarzkopf. So there's opera in the movie versions, of course. Then there's opera symphony third, opera symphony and piano and chamber music, etc., performed in the movies, okay, for the characters in the movies. In other words, performed for the characters to be watching and enjoying. The two that come to mind most is in Moonstruck, and these two are, Moonstruck, they went to La Boheme. Remember going to the opera? And how wonderful it kind of reflected a little bit of what was going on in the relationship. Likewise, in an almost parallel moment where he says something about if you understand opera, you're going to understand it forever, you're going to love it forever. Julia Roberts gets taken by Richard Gere in Pretty Woman to see La Traviata. Both heroines died of consumption, so there's a certain kind of parallel thing going on there. Then there's music when it's a part of the plot. In Philadelphia, do you remember that wonderful aria that Maria Callas sang from Andrea Chenier by Umberto Giardino? It's called La Mama Morta. And this wonderful, wonderful outpouring of emotion, but it was actually woven into the plot in this kind of wonderful way, and also kind of continued the stereotype of gay people liking opera, I guess, in a certain way. But it was an important important moment for classical music in film, because it was a really, really beautifully done moment to show how involved someone was in opera and why they felt that way about it. And then, of course, the last category is when music is background to the film itself, or in other words, a soundtrack. And of course, there are certain ones we associate, which is what? It's the Wagner, right, of the Valkyries, but it was in Apocalypse Now. Remember when the helicopters were flying, that incredible music? But I think that one of the pieces that is going to actually always be implanted in my mind as being part of a score to a movie is this. after the orchestra cuts off, the organ is still playing. And the organ, this is a piece called Also Sprach Zarathustra, based on a book by Nietzsche. And it has several parts. The beginning is actually called Sunrise, but there's several parts in the structure. But what happens is most people think that's it, strangely. That's only the first minute and a half. This is a 30-minute tone poem by Richard Strauss. And it is an amazing, amazing work. There are lots of stories that come from one particular set of performances of this with the Chicago Symphony. Reiner, in I believe 1956 or so, there was the first stereo recording of this work of Also Sprach Zarathustra. And Reiner, of course, is famous. He was one of Bernstein's teachers, along with Koussevitzky, famous for his tiny little beat. He beat like this, he would be going. And when he went like this, the orchestra exploded. All right. So he had this tiny little beat. Well, in the rehearsal, he had just taken over the Chicago Symphony. He was cleaning out the dead wood, as they say. He was getting rid of people. And one of the bass players, when he went over to give a cue, had his binoculars up. Reiner nodded, and after they took a break, he came back and he started back at the same spot. And when the bass player unwisely held his binoculars up, Reiner held up a little tiny card that said, "You're fired." And he meant it. That was the bass player's last rehearsal. Also, I've told you the story before, but there's this one part that goes, and the trumpet plays. That's a high C. And the first trumpet player of the Chicago Symphony was a man named Adolf Hirseth, who's not only reputed to be the best trumpet player or the best brass player, but by some accounts, the best orchestral musician that's ever existed. He was an amazing trumpet player, and that's why the Chicago Symphony has that amazing brass sound, and famous for their brass sound, due to Hirseth and his leading of the brass section. But Reiner had just taken over the orchestra, and I think he kind of wanted to make a point because he went over that and he said didn't like it, and he went back and did it again. Now this little note, that high C disappears. It's got a decrescendo that disappears. It says al niente, into nothing. So you're supposed to hit a high C on the trumpet and then make it get softer and softer until you can't hear it anymore. And it fades into the texture of the rest of the orchestra. So he did it about 15 or 16 times in a row. And Hirseth finally said to Maestro Reiner, if you're attempting to make me split a note, I can assure you I can play this 100 times in a row without cracking a note. So I suggest you don't waste any more of the orchestra's time. Reiner nodded and went on. It set such a high bar for the rest of the orchestra. You knew that when you came to that rehearsal, you better be able to do your part 100 times in a row without a mistake. In fact, there's a famous quote. Richard Strauss, the composer of this piece, was also quite a famous conductor. He'd made lots of famous quotes about conducting, like "Don't even look at the brass; they're too loud already," and things like that. But there's one passage that goes like, and it goes all the way up in the orchestra, and the second violins have this. It's very difficult, awkward, and. He was rehearsing it, and then some poor little second violinist came up and said, "Maestro, this is so hard for me, this passage, but I went home and I want you to know that I practiced it for hours diligently, and I want to show you now that I can play it absolutely perfectly." And he went, and, Strauss said, "Oh, that's too bad." He said, "What I really wanted was this big kind of whoosh, this dusty whoosh, where everybody's kind of not exactly playing the right notes, and then it just sweeps." The poor guy. Poor fellow. He probably didn't really mean that. But anyway, this piece is so wonderful. And in college, I was going to do a classical corner one time about score reading, but I'll do that another time. But when you're studying conducting, you have to read scores. You have to look, and this, a classical score for an orchestra, a tone poem like this, is a large undertaking. There are clarinets, flutes, oboes, bassoons. The clarinets are in different keys. Some in E flat, some in B flat. There are horns in F, so a different transposition. Trumpets, trombones, timpani. You have bells, organ, in this case, and then of course the complete string complement, first and second violins, violas, cello, an orchestra of about 90 or 100 generally to play this kind of work, to make it sound right. And so I was always wonderfully curious about this work, so I started score reading it. And what I wanted you to kind of realize is that that minute and a half, the piece that comes right afterwards is so glorious and so deep. I'm going to give you a little bit of an impression. See if I can get this to work better, the organ thing. Give you a little bit of an impression of this. But, of course, so we talked about this. This is timpani with organ in the low C, and the contrabass is way down there, and he's actually tuned the bottom contrabasses down from this E, which is usually their note, down to a C, scoratura. So he's got lower notes, and they're usually played by basses. Certain basses can do that. They have an extra string. So the trumpet comes in, piano, and the whole orchestra is tutti, right? And decrescendos to piano, and then back up the forte and the timpani. Mezzo forte, it's getting a little louder. And the whole orchestra tutti again. The strings and the woodwinds. And the trombones, that one will scale down, and then at a decrescendo, and a crescendo back up, and it cuts off, leaving the organ for half a bar. I think just Strauss wanted to make sure that you knew that there was an organ there, because you don't really hear it. But then what happens is magical. You get the basses and the organ. Bassoons, back to the basses. Pizzicato. Horns in octaves. More horns. 4 horns doing this. And then the cellos come in with this melody. In the middle with the top part. He adds strings. Listen to the chromaticism in the chords and the melody. The violins, most of them aren't even in yet. The violins are finally. English horn playing that with the bassoon. So anyway, this wonderful tone poem its beauty can only be vaguely approximated on the piano. So I'm going to ask Gil if he would play for you. I'm going to play this little section that I've just played in the orchestra, and you can hear all the colors, but the wonderful sweep of the strings and how they kind of just reach in and grab you inside because of the passion of this theme. So would you play this for me, Gil? This is the beginning, and I apologize because when I hear this music, it's hard for me not to conduct, so I may start conducting from time to time. All right. Turn it up just a bit, because to enjoy this, you really have to make it. So that is Mr. Strauss's wonderful tone poem, Also Sprach Zarathustra. So give it a listen, because it's a shame just to know those first few measures of this wonderful, wonderful piece. So to finish off, I would like to do a little live performing. I've invited our wonderful singers that were here last week. So please, Heather Peterson and Angela Prenti are going to come up. This piece is called Bellamy, or Bellamy d'Amour. It's from Tales of Hoffmann by Offenbach. And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing, normally just called the barcarolle, because it has that wonderful ya-da-da-da. I've talked about barcarolle before, how it's based on the swaying of the boat. And this is a wonderful, wonderful duet. So are you guys ready? Can you see? Yeah? Good? Okay, and this has a wonderful introduction to it. So this is the beginning of Act 3. So there's where you see the scene happen. You hear the music. It's very evocative of the canals and Venice and that kind of feeling. So here we go. And Heather Peterson. And that was featured in Life is Beautiful and many other movies, actually. So thank you. Take your break. We'll see you afterwards. Enjoy your break, and we'll see you back.